Welcome to part 2 of our look at classic British jet fighters of the 1950s with the fabulous Joe Welding at the Tangmere Military Aviation Museum in Sussex. If you haven't caught part 1, do check that one out before we get started, because we're jumping in with my favourite jet of all time, the Hawker Hunter.
So this aircraft went through a lot, like all airplanes, F-86 included, MiG-15 included, went through a lot of growing pains, because all of a sudden now you're in a new speed regime. You've got a new style of wing that does not like to play well, like at all. You've got tail details you've got to fix. You've got engine inlets you've got to start to deal with. You've got powered controls. Now all of a sudden we're getting fast enough where the human force can't overpower tails of this size once they start getting transonic flow over them. All of that made these airplanes really, really challenging, and also made them very unsafe in a lot of configurations. I've never been able to find the same fact in the American side. I'm sure it's similar. In the years from, I'll get the dates not perfectly right, but after World War II up until like 1951 or something, I think it's 36 British test pilots lost their lives. Like, it's on the order of like one every other month or something like that. And it's all due to nothing against the Brit designers or the companies. These airplanes were just super challenging. Like I said, I'm sure America's probably got a similar number. I've never been able to find it, but.
Because at the time, supersonic wind tunnels are almost pre-infancy.
Yeah.
They're, the stuff that is pulled out of Germany and brought back, all of those sorts of things. So they're doing this sort of development and understanding of the science in aircraft at times, which is why you've got the DH-108, the sort of tailless aircraft that Geoffrey de Havilland gets killed in, the 110 that the pilot whose name's gone straight out of my head that I've literally just looked at the board at, died at Farnborough.
Was that the Wimpy Wade crash?
We can start just this. Anyways, we're digressing. We'll do this over a beer in a minute.
Right. But yeah, so the wind tunnels, we touched on that a little bit last time as well, but that's an important story here as well. A lot of people say, well, why'd they have to risk human lives? Why don't you just put this in a wind tunnel? And the problem is supersonic wind tunnel technology at the time. So I was referring earlier to this Vulcan Road Research Institute in Germany. It has some fabulous world-class wind tunnels, and a bunch of them, like 6 of them. And a couple of them, I think, will go up to like Mach 4. Like, they were just unbelievable. I've actually been to that site, stomping around in the woods, trying to find evidence of those wind tunnels, and I did find the foundation of one of them. That's another story, which we could talk about someday. But the problem with the wind tunnels was when you go supersonic, you get a shock wave. And that shock wave, right when you're going Mach 1, essentially is a straight wall that goes like 90 degrees to the aircraft. And as you go faster, that like starts to pivot back and more and more. Where they were having problems was transonic, which means you're technically not going supersonic, but as the airflow accelerates over the wing and the tails, it probably locally goes transonic or supersonic. So you'll get a shock wave that comes up just locally, like on the wing and on the tail. And so if you go try to replicate that in a wind tunnel, the problem is that shock wave comes up, it hits the wall of the wind tunnel, it bounces back, and it totally wrecks everything you're trying to measure. Like, so in those days, wind tunnel at those like low supersonic and transonic speeds just didn't work. You couldn't get anything reliable out of them. If you went fast enough, that cone gets back far enough, it actually reflects and then goes behind the model. But in that spot that you really care about, it's right on top of the model. So they were essentially worthless. The only way you could get good data was to go test these airplanes for real. They eventually solved that by putting plates in the wind tunnel with perforated holes, and they could suck the air on those walls, and then they could make that shock wave go away before it reflected back. But I think that was probably mid to late 50s before that technology was invented. So in that early jet stage, you had to go out and test it. There was really just no other question. So this airplane went through a lot of iterations. So one of the things, we talked a little bit about how the Meteor and the de Havilland, the Vampire, were basically designed around the engines. And so you had somewhat different configurations. Even though the wings were about the same, the configuration of the airplane was somewhat changing. So the Meteor specifically, they really did just start with a clean slate of like, how do we do this, right? I think another thing that set some of these companies back, including North America with the F-86 before they learned about swept wings, is most of these aircraft, or these companies at least, had existing pretty successful designs, right? So at Hawker, you had the Tempest, which had a great high-speed wing, an evolution of the Typhoon with an even better high-speed wing. At North American, of course, you had the Mustang with one of the best piston high-speed wings ever. Supermarine had the Spiteful, which was a Mustang-like wing essentially on a Spitfire. And so all these companies had some knowledge. So the very first aircraft they all built was basically just that same airplane with a jet engine stuck in the fuselage. So Supermarine, you got the Attacker. That thing was even so similar, it was actually a tail dragger, right, of all things.
It's the same wing and part of the same fuselage, isn't it?
Yeah, this fuselage, the tail, it was literally a Spiteful with a slightly enlarged to stuff a jet engine in it, right? At North American, you had the Fury, which was much the same. Wasn't quite a Mustang fuselage, but the wings and the tail were certainly there. So that was kind of the history there, right?
Because Hawker had the Seahawk.
Yes, Hawker the Seahawk. That's what I was trying to get to here. Yeah, exactly. So once this swept wing thing came out, they kind of didn't really have time or funds. That was the other problem, is the British government was not investing in this in the same way that the Americans were, just because they couldn't. Like, British government was a lot worse off financially as a country than America was.
And they were trying to support a lot of different aircraft companies, so there's a little bit of money going around for everybody.
Yeah.
He says, I'm just coming back around this way because...
Yeah, so exactly. It's just the funds weren't there. So the fact that they did what they did, and there's actually a happy ending to the story, which we'll come to at the end here, somewhat happy. So this originally was the Seahawk. They went through, I think, 9 design iterations from there to here. I think 5 of them got built. So I think they did 5 different prototypes before getting to this aircraft. And you or the commenters will correct me if I'm wrong. I believe this airframe is the first prototype for the Hunter. I think I read that, which is a P1067, which was the final prototype that really was, okay, this is a Hunter now. Before it was a production aircraft, and then they converted it to this by putting in an afterburner. This is, and man,
I think you're correct. He says, looking over his shoulder to the wonderful staff here at Tangmere. And they're giving us all the same look. But yes, there we go.
Yeah. So anyway, again, we can correct that later if I'm wrong about that. Let me first say, I love this airplane. This thing is not just this specific airframe because of its history. The Hawker Hunter, in my opinion, is like, it's kind of like an AK-47, right? It's like if you tell somebody draw a jet from the 50s, this is what they draw, right?
Yep.
Like, it is just an iconic shape. And it's not just like the lines are like nearly perfect. Look how clean this thing is. And again, this is the record setter, so it's probably even more clean, but not by much. The production aircraft looked pretty much like this, with the exception of some gun ports and a few things like that. It's just a very clean airplane. I think the engine inlets, we talked about bifurcated ducts having their issues. Certainly that was the case here. This airplane did have issues with engine stalls and so forth, but for the time, is pretty darn good. And the fact that it has no extra wetted area, right? So you look at the Meteor behind it, you're almost doubling, or probably not quite double, but look how much more surface area those nacelles have compared to the fuselage. And all of this is just inside. Yeah. And even the inlets, like, there's nothing extra there. So it's, very, very clean design.
And of course, we're more fuel efficient now. So basically, the Meteor's fuselage is a fuel tank.
Yeah.
Whereas in here, you can start being a lot more clever about packaging.
Yep.
And because you're not burning bucket loads of the stuff just to get it in.
Yeah. So this airplane, one of the things that about what Halley refers to as a second generation swept wings, but early enough to where they don't have afterburners yet. And so the afterburner is really what you need if you want to have a practical supersonic airplane. So this and the Swift, which we'll come to, both could absolutely go supersonic in a dive, but they just didn't have enough thrust to go to super cruise, to get there in level flight. This one did, right? Because this one did have an afterburner.
This is the only afterburnt, if that's even the right grammar, Hunter ever made.
And that's a development story in itself. Like, this is the era where afterburners are brand new, right? And they don't work very well, and they burn themselves out, and cooling them and the right materials and all of that. Like, in my opinion, like, this should have had an afterburner. You could say that probably about a lot of jets, but it just didn't because of the time.
It's so pretty. Sorry.
It's so beautiful. So yeah, so this aircraft did break the speed record briefly in 1951. I don't remember what the speed was, but it, was in a position to be able to do that, and it did it. And I think it took it from the F-86.
27.63 miles an hour.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, so remarkable
I'm cheating to because
sure.
it says it right there.
And so one more thing we can talk about while we're here, again, talking about the evolution of aero, are tails. And the tails are really important. So probably as important as the wing, not for performance, but for actually the safety of the aircraft, the controllability of it. So another thing that typically is the design detail for these second-gen jets is that they did not have what's called an all-flying tail. And there's two different ways people refer to this. The later jets had a true all-flying tail, which means that whole tail pivots on a pivot axis kind of right underneath the flag up there. And when you move the control stick, of course it's powered by hydraulics, but that whole thing would pivot up and down as you move the control stick. And we'll see that when we get to lightning in a minute. Some people also refer to this as an all-flying tail, but it's kind of a halfway step in that you can see that kind of wedge shape up front. That's like a fairing. So this whole thing would pivot, but due to trim. So it only would pivot up and down maybe a few degrees. Now that's really important because once you start going transonic, the center of lift on your wing tends to move aft, and it wants to, the aircraft wants to pitch down. And so you could basically pivot that tail and help trim that out. And that was a really important feature. That was one of the things that the X-1 rocket-powered, first supersonic airplane pioneered, is they kind of had an idea that was going to be needed because of prior experience on, diving Spitfires and P-38s and aircraft like that, which did not have that feature. So they put that on the X-1, and Chuck Yeager, one of the things leading up to a supersonic flight is he basically learned how to fly the airplane with the trim switch, not with the control stick. And so that's a very slow process. And on something like an X-1 where you're just trying to do it nice, slow, and steady, it works fine. Less so for a fighter where you're trying to, dogfight at those speeds. So that lesson was really clearly learned on the X-1. I think that information was kind of broadly disseminated, intentionally or unintentionally, but all of this era airplanes ended up with that, not on the very first model, but eventually. And so that's really the secret to how an airplane like this could successfully fly supersonic in a dive, is just that ability to control it. Yeah, most of it on this one. Why don't we go talk about the Swift for a little bit? So now we see what some people might call the arch nemesis of the Hawker, the Supermarine Swift. Very mixed reputation on this one. Mostly, I think it comes down to kind of bad luck in some ways, and lack of support. I think probably is the bigger thing. So these two aircraft are extremely similar. Just the configuration, I think they both used both the Avon and the Sapphire engine at different times, so essentially same engine. Subtle differences, this has separate intakes as opposed to the leading edge intakes, but they're essentially the same airplane that was designed to do the same thing. And I think the story on this is that Hawker was a little bit ahead in the beginning, and so won more of the Air Ministry support to actually get funds and produce it. Supermarine, I think, continued on their own for a while. At some point, because of all the learning curve we just talked about, the Hunter started to fall behind. So then the Air Ministry then gave Supermarine money as a backup, saying, hey, this is not going well. And again, nobody really knew at the time how hard this actually was, so they thought Hawker was just screwing it up. So they gave Supermarine a bunch more money to say, get this done, because if the Hawker never gets there, the Hunter never gets there, then you guys are it. Well, so they started down the path and have all their own same problems. Like it's almost like the problems that plagued these two airplanes were almost identical in slightly different ways, and the subtleties of the wing design and airfoils and so forth. But both of them had engine surge problems. Both of them had tail controllability problems. Both of them had wing airflow separation at high angles of attack, which we can talk about a little bit here. This aircraft has what's called, some people call this a cuff, some people call it a sawtooth leading edge. The Hunter eventually ended up with this. This model doesn't have it, but the later models have this exact same thing. And what that is as you get to high angles of attack on this airplane, either at low speed or at high speed, you'll get flow that's going outboard on the wing, not just flowing over it straight. As it goes outboard, the boundary layer gets thicker and thicker, and that's a layer of air that wants to stick to this wing surface and not like go full speed. That has lower energy, and it doesn't like to stick to the wing as well. And so at high angles of attack, it'll separate, and then you get a stall. Happens on Mustangs and Spitfires and everything. The separation does, not because of the sweep though. The problem with a swept wing is because the wing root is up here, kind of closer to or even ahead of the center of gravity of the aircraft. The tip is way back here, way past the center of gravity. Once this part of the wing separates and stalls, the aircraft wants to pitch up because it's not balanced anymore. And that was one of the big learnings of swept wings that made them really, really hard to do. There was a term when I was researching this that I'd never heard before, but it makes total sense. They called it turn tightening. And what that means is if you're pulling high Gs in a maneuver, like a dogfighting maneuver, and this starts to happen, the aircraft wants to pitch up, and so it actually wants to turn even harder in an unstable way to where all of a sudden you've lost, whole wing is stalled and you've lost all control. So, and that can happen at high speed just as it can, at low speed right on landing. So a sawtooth leading edge like this or a cuff, what it does is as this flow is flowing outboard, and especially at high angles of attack, you'll get flow that kind of comes up in this this crease here, and it actually makes a big vortex that kind of acts as what I'll call a virtual fence. So some airplanes of this era, MiG-15 is a good example, has a literal fence, which is this big plate of metal right here that keeps that flow from flowing outboard. Problem with it is that causes extra drag. This design with that, what I'll call the virtual fence, solves the same problem, but when you're in high-speed flight, it causes a little bit of drag, but not nearly as much. So it's a good design compromise. And you'll see a lot of jets of this era. F4 has it. Lightning, we'll get to in a second, it has a very novel way of doing this that does the same thing, but it doesn't look like this. So yeah, again, the 100 gets this eventually. So to cut to the end of that story, this thing was plagued with lots of problems on low-speed handling. They were desperate to get this out. So we were talking earlier about Great Britain aerospace being behind. Well, the other thing I was going to mention is right after the war, the British said, we're not going to fight another war for 10 years. So we can invest in, the Labour government at the time, we can invest in things like social reform, NHS, et cetera, which few people would argue was not a great idea.
Which is how Labour got in.
Yeah, exactly. But it also meant no funds for aircraft. And again, the thought was, we don't need these right away. Let's pause that for the moment. We'll catch up. Well, what happened in the meantime? 1949, Soviets get an atomic bomb. 1950, Korean War. All of a sudden, the military's desperate. Like, hey, this isn't 10 years away. This is here now. So we need to get these aircraft into service. So a lot of the negativity toward this aircraft is because it was really rushed into service before it should have been. It had a whole lot of limitations. We were talking about separation. I think this wasn't on the aircraft at that time. There were some other details on the inlets, on the tail, et cetera, that just weren't ready. But it was ahead of the Hunter, so they said, don't care. We need something, put it in service.
And the shock of the Meteor's performance in Korea.
Yeah.
Which
yes.
threw things down, which is why you then have Central Fighter School sending pilots to fly with Gabby Gabreski and everybody flying F-86s. And
yeah.
The Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona is home to one of the largest non-government funded aviation and space museums in the world. Featuring nearly 400 aircraft, the museum is home to an incredible collection like NASA's NB-52 X-15 dropship and 747 SP Sophia Airborne Observatory, to a wealth of rare military types from air forces all around the world, to the first production 777 and the second prototype 787 Dreamliner. Whether you're a military or civilian aviation geek, there will be an incredible aircraft around every corner of this epic 80-acre site for you to explore. As the aviation show's partnership with the Pima Air and Space Museum enters its third year, we're delighted to say that Pima is truly a top of your bucket list museum to visit. And it keeps getting better because the Philippine Mars is now on display, and right across the car park, the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum's doors are wide open to welcome you in to check out an amazing collection of tanks, armored fighting vehicles, and other vehicles if you get fed up with all the airplanes. To find out more about the incredible collection and the fantastic events coming up at the Pima Air and Space Museum, and of course the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum, head over to www.pimaair.org to plan your trip to one of the world's great aviation collections, and one that now includes tanks next door, if that's your sort of thing.
So as soon as the Hunter actually surpassed this in not having those problems, they canceled this, canceled it as a primary fighter, and then turned it into a photo reconnaissance aircraft. And it actually was quite successful, from what I can understand, is that, because it's a totally different mission, right? You're cruising around at low altitude, relatively high speed, less maneuverability. High altitude was one of the problems on this aircraft, and everything I just talked about gets worse as you go higher. And so if you can keep it low, you can kind of cover up a lot of issues that the airplane might have had. And from what I understand, the pilots who flew it in that PR mission, they loved it. And I forget, there was 100 and some of these built, and it was quite good in that role for the time, right? Because they sent them over to Germany. It was when the Cold War was really ramping up, and they were needing to figure out, like, where are the Germans across the border, and can we stay on top of that, so if like war all of a sudden does break out, we can know where to target things. So
I keep going on about the Hunter being pretty. I'm not a fan of the Swift, but it has some lovely lines on it.
Yeah.
And it's, you can almost say that the sort of the cockpit layout intakes is very similar to what you'll see on F-102, 106, just not as pointy. That same sort of shoulder-mounted intakes.
And in some ways, like if the Hunter didn't exist, I think everyone would have a much higher opinion of this airplane. But because they're so similar, it's like you kind of want to compare them, right?
And the Hunter being damn near perfect, but there we go. Which is why it's still flying today.
Yeah.
Doing its thing. Okay, where to next?
Let's go look at the Lightning.
Yes.
So real quick, before we get to the Lightning, this is a Hunter F5. It's got a sort of an interesting, which I haven't gotten to the bottom of, feature, and that's this bulge right here. So on this aircraft, and I understand the Swift had the same problem, and it must be related to the 30 millimeter cannon that these had. What I've read is that essentially, you know, these eject the shell casings and the links, the ammo links, outside the aircraft as it's shooting. The shell casings had enough mass that when they shot out, they had enough energy that they got clear of the airplane. As they're coming out, they disconnect from the links, so all this stuff is just kind of scattering. The links are these little sheet metal, I haven't seen any around here, these little sheet metal pieces that don't have mass or energy. Oh, actually, right here. Yes, right here. So these little pieces have next to no mass. When they were getting out in the airflow at these high speeds, these things were coming back and damaging the airplane by hitting it. So these bulges were designed to catch those links. And I think somehow, I don't see the slots, but I think the shell casings would exit out, but those links would get collected in here. And then when they landed, they'd have to open this up and dump all of those out after a firing mission.
So here is the Aiden cannon pod for the 4-pack of Aidens, which then just gets used with that ratchet. Goes straight up underneath in there behind the models of all that. So it's, so F5 still has the straight leading edge without the...
This one does, yeah. I think it was the next rev that got
I can't remember which number that is. But
8 maybe?
Yeah. Right, okay, so everybody can see it and everybody wants to talk about it because everybody loves it.
Talk about the grill in the room, right?
Yes.
So I would argue this airplane is when the British aerospace organizations finally got caught up, right? And you could argue maybe this one was slightly behind, but much less so than the last two aircraft. So this one, I actually don't know where people officially put this, and again, fighter generations is made up anyway, but I personally would put this in generation 3, which is, what that is your, actually maybe generation 4, somewhere 3.5, let's call it. And so to me, the generation 3 is a true supersonic airplane, right? So it's got an afterburner, it's got all the other things you need, the right tail, the right wing design to actually go supersonic. So the early century series in this nomenclature, I would consider all generation 3. Generation 4 is more subtle, but it really takes that to the next level. So you're probably talking a Mach 2 airplane. You're probably starting to get, on most of them, inlets that have moving parts. And then the other big change that I think that most people put in Gen 4 is weapon systems. systems. So much more fire control ability, not just having having a radar, perhaps, and if you do have a radar, ability to track individual aircraft, the interconnectivity between the radar and the missiles and targets, and all of those avionics type stuff that are a whole new level that are now starting to come into these airplanes. So I put this airplane somewhere in there, right? It probably doesn't have the sophistication of weapon systems, at least at first, that like an F-4 has. I think it gets some more of that later, but performance-wise, hell yeah, it's there. So what's also unique about this airplane, well, there's two things I think that really make it stand out. One is, we were talking about the Hunter being a beautiful airplane, and it's what a 10-year-old draws if you tell them to draw an airplane. This doesn't really look like that. This is one of those sort of oddballs of the aviation world that really nothing else looks like this, and for a bunch of reasons, right? The nose and the cockpit, I mean, you could argue it looks a little like a MiG-21, but the vertical engines, one on top of one another, the extreme sweep, it has ailerons on the tips of the wing. Like, in my opinion, this is a really innovative airplane for its time that I think is a great thing. You know,
it's a design led by problem solving a lot of other problems.
Yes, and for what I understand, the real reason that led to that is because English Electric didn't have a killer piston engine fighter at the end of the war. So they literally were starting with a clean slate. They weren't trying to reuse a wing or a tail or landing gear or anything like that. They're like, okay, we're going to do this. Let's do this right, and let's start from the beginning. And this is what you get. So I really appreciate about that airplane. Or that about this airplane. And I think they got it right. Like, this thing actually just does what it says. It's great. The other thing about this airplane is it's kind of as an outlier as far as where it sits if you like do all the big stat tables of all the airplanes. So it's a twin, which is part of the reason for its success. It's got gobs of thrust. I think this airplane has higher thrust to weight ratio than anything else in its class. Not by a lot, but at least by a little. And yet, so it's a twin, yet it's not a big bloated twin like a lot of airplanes of this class ends up to be. So the Century series, you know, the early Century series were all in the 30,000 pound class range, gross takeoff weight, so 30, 32, 34, something like that. You get to the twins like the F-101, eventually the F-4, they're pushing up to like the 50,000 pound range. This one's like right in the middle. So it's in the like low 40s, 1,000 pound range. So heavier than your singles, but with double the thrust. So you get this airplane that is just a hot rod. So I think, I don't know what part of the climb it is because it changes as you go up, but there's one point in this thing's climb profile where it'll climb at 50,000 feet per minute. Now, that's sustainable. It's not saying you can get to 50,000 feet in 1 minute, but that is a phenomenal number. And it's because for being a twin, it's a big airplane, but it's not that big and it's not that heavy. So, and that's what it was designed to do. So this is all about defense of Great Britain in case Soviet bombers are coming. So it's very much like a Spitfire in that standpoint, right? It doesn't have a lot of range, at least initially, because it's got two big thirsty engines, but it doesn't need it. All it needs to do is get off the ground, get up to altitude, and shoot the bad guy down before he or she is dropping their bombs. And again, I think it's really good for that. Yeah, so once you get up to those upper Mach 1s, Mach 2 range, you've got to have some sort of an inlet that has a shock wave that gets better efficient air to the engines. This has a axisymmetric inlet, much like the F4. That's a half axisymmetric, but same technology. Just like the F4, this inlet has no moving parts. It literally is just a fixed shape in there, which on later airplanes you really could get away with. So pretty remarkable inlet design. The other thing about this airplane that I really love, so the F-104 gets there kind of by brute force. Big engine, no wing, no drag. It's kind of a one-trick pony. Gets up fast, can shoot something down, that's it. Don't ask it to maneuver. This thing actually has a wing loading where it does everything I just said. Takes off, climbs fast, goes really screaming fast. But actually, when you get there, it has a big enough wing to actually maneuver. So I think this is a way more well-rounded airplane than like an F-104. It's just remarkable. I love it. So couple of the design features that I think are interesting on here: highly swept wing. I forget, this is like a 6-degree sweep or something, more like what you see on a Delta wing. Probably more than it needs, but I think, again, given the times where money was short, they didn't have time to get it wrong. So I think they just said, let's oversweep it a little and move on. And it worked, right? Like, this thing just worked. But it's not a Delta wing, so if if you show a top view of this airplane, there is a cutback in the trailing edge. And what that does is it has much lower wing drag than a delta wing does. One of the problems with delta wings is they've got a lot of wing area, so they end up producing more drag, even though they tend to work pretty good. So this notch does the exact same thing that the cuff does on the Hunter and on the Swift. So it essentially, at high angle of attack, air is going to flow up through here in this direction, cause a vortex, and make a virtual fence as it goes out. In high-speed flight, where the airflow is coming in parallel, again, a little bit of drag, but in the grand scheme of things, not much. So a pretty clever little design that's even less obtrusive than the sawtooth leading edge that you see on the Swift and the Hunter. The second thing is technically this airplane's not area ruled, meaning it doesn't have like the Coke bottle shape that you would see, like that top spine would like sink down, or if you look at it in top view, it would suck in if it was truly area ruled. It doesn't have that. But I would argue this shape of a wing, long, slender wing with the trailing edge cut out, actually is its own form of area ruling. So I think that's one of the secrets on why this airplane has so much speed. And I don't know the exact numbers. I know at some point this airplane would reach Mach like 2.3, which is really fast. I don't know if the very first one would do that. That might have been later with engine upgrades, but at some point it would go that fast, which is great. Another feature, if they got the tail absolutely right on this. So if you look at the horizontal tail, it's an all-flying tail, like we've talked about. So that whole thing pivots with pilot control. And I would argue it's in the right spot. So this is the same spot that the Century Series fighter, the F-100, came up with after a whole bunch of low-speed wind tunnel testing.
We can just come back around.
Yeah. And what's great there is we were talking about wing stalls earlier. And as the wing starts to stall, your wingtips always stall first on a highly swept wing, or typically. As they start to stall, your airplane wants to pitch up. So with a low tail here, there's another phenomenon that's going on in aerodynamics called downwash. And what that is coming off the wing, the air has a downward component of velocity, and that hits the tail. And the tail, part of that influence is what balances the aircraft. So when you put a tail in that position, that is in the optimum spot to feel the presence of that downwash. So as soon as you start to stall, your lift is coming down, your downwash is coming down, it's not pushing down as much. So a tail in that position tends to naturally, somewhat, not 100%, but naturally balance the airplane in a way that a higher tail is way less effective. So I think they nailed it here. I don't know the backstory there. I don't know if they came to that on their own or if they were able to get some of those learnings from the F-100 as well. Could be both. I don't know. But either way, it doesn't matter. They got it right, in my opinion. I
think.
Go ahead.
I'm looking at my battery level.
Okay.
And we've been going for a while. You are a fan of this thing.
I am.
And it is huge. If we were to sort of do a sort of wrap-up comparison between all of the different types, we spoke about Pima in Denver, and this sort of very quick look at 4 or 5 British aircraft. Mm-hmm. You say they guess it right by Lightning, which then goes Tornado, and all the learnings.
Yep.
You can say TSR-2 fits in there as well, but that's a whole other story.
Yeah.
What would be your takeaway about the parallel British design philosophy in the end?
So one of the metrics I looked up before we started here is also remember America is a much larger company or country with way more people, way more aircraft companies and so forth.
You'll look better with the Lightning there.
Yeah. So if you look at number of aircraft produced in this time frame, so call it end of the war or even during the war up to like mid-1950s, I think British produced 13 independent airplanes that actually made it into production, jets, right? Mm-hmm. Per capita, that is 20% more than America did, which is a pretty fascinating statistic, isn't it? So yeah, some of these were a couple years behind, maybe they could have been better, et cetera. But the fact that the British were still absolutely pulling their weight. Unfortunately for the British, because America got there sooner, some of our airplanes had a lot more production levels. Not to say, I mean, a Hunter, I think 5,000 of them or 4,000 of them produced, something like that. It was still a lot. But the F-86, I think, had 10,000 or 9,000 or something like that. So the British aircraft in the end didn't have quite the production numbers that the United States did. The F-86, for instance, like I said, was similar to the Hunter, probably 2x, if not more, because the F-86 got there first. But yeah, in the sheer development, absolutely, Great Britain was pulling its weight. And I think the ultimate footnote on all of this has to be Concorde. Everything we just talked about, from engines to supersonic inlets to 3D aero, flight controls, hydraulics, etc., all went into Concorde. And the fact that Concorde, you can argue about its business success. Technologically, it absolutely hit the nail on the head. It was the fact that they got that airplane successful and certified still blows my mind. And so that is the legacy of everything we just saw.
So there we go.
That says it all.
Yeah. Super. Thank you so much, Joe. Shall we go to the pub?
Sounds good to me.
I'd like to say thanks to all of our fantastic supporters over on Patreon. If you head over to our Patreon page, you can join the fun from just £3 a month, plus a bit of VAT, get your name in these very credits, and get all the episodes ad-free and early as soon as I get the edit finished. The Aviation Show is hosted and produced by Matt Bowe and is a Boney Abroad production.